Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Michaela Way, and I'm the Indigenous Peoples Liaison for North America at the Food and Agricultural Organization's Liaison Office for North America, based in Washington, D.C., and with the Indigenous Peoples Unit based in Rome, Italy. I have the pleasure of serving as co-moderator today with Tara Madri. Tara, over to you.
Bonjour, everybody. Mishwa Nangukwe Njishnakas, Wanatiang Nandojaba, Mashiki and Dudam. Good morning, my relatives. My name is Tara Madri. I'm an enrolled citizen of the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians. I'm from near where the river bends, or what we now know as Detroit, Michigan, and I've been what many know as an urban Indigenous or urban Native person my whole life. I'm currently living and working in Baltimore, Maryland, where I'm finishing up my master's degree in human nutrition at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. The majority of my studies focuses on urban Native food security and food sovereignty, and I'm really thrilled to be here and to share the space with all of you. Today, in celebration of International Women's Day, we honor Indigenous women in North America and globally as change makers, currently and since time immemorial. We are fortunate to be joined by distinguished speakers who are Indigenous women of North America and leaders in our communities. Today, they will share with us their experiences in research, policymaking, land and water stewardship, food systems, and public health. Michaela, over to you.
On behalf of the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, we would like to extend a very warm welcome and thank you all for joining today's webinar. Before proceeding with our program, there are a few housekeeping items I would like to go over. Firstly, I would like to advise you that this event is being recorded and is also being live streamed on Twitter at FAO North America. Please join the conversation on Twitter and follow us at FAO North America, #Indigenous Women and #Women's Day. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat box and where you're joining us from. Please also note that you can enter your questions into the Q&A box at the lower right-hand corner of your screen, stating your name and affiliation, and if any, whom your question is directed towards. We will not be able to make full and proper introductions for all of our distinguished speakers today due to time constraints. However, their full biographies will be made available to you in the chat box. Today, we are joined by over 800 people from around the world. We are sure there are many Indigenous food experts and change makers in the audience. We are very grateful for your work and for you taking the time to join us in this space. Tara?
Lastly, we'll provide a brief overview of how this event will be structured. In a moment, I will pass the floor to Elder Rose Highbear, who will open our time together with prayer and song, followed by welcoming remarks from FAO. We will then hear a message from Representative Deb Haaland, followed by high-level remarks from Director Heather Dawn Thompson of the Office of Tribal Relations at the United States Department of Agriculture. Dr. Priscilla Settee will deliver the keynote address on her research and recent publications. To conserve time, we will then introduce all three of our panelists, Beth Roach, Elisa Levi, and Mariana Estrada, who will expand upon our discussions on the influence and priorities of Indigenous women in food systems. We will then transition to the Q&A portion of our program, at which time Michaela and myself will begin posing questions from the audience to our speakers based upon your entries in the Zoom Q&A box. Thereafter, we will hear about the way forward and key messages. Elder Rose Highbear will join us again in closing our virtual gathering. We will endeavor to end the session promptly at 11:30 Eastern Standard Time. Now, it is my great honor to introduce Rose Highbear. Rose is Daikatan Dene and Inupiaq, originally from the Athabascan village of McGrath on Alaska's Kuskokwim River. She now lives in Marion County, Oregon. She is the founder of Wisdom Farm and former executive director of 27 years for Wisdom of the Elders in Portland, Oregon. Rose, we are so grateful you can join us this morning and open our time together. Miigwetchin, thank you. Over to you.
Good morning, my relatives of all colors. I'm so happy to be here today and honored to sing this song. Hail, oh, hail, hail, oh, hail, hail, oh, hail, hail, oh, hail, hail. Hail, oh, hail, hail, hail. Tankashila grandfathers who watch over us from these four great directions, we thank you for this beautiful day you have given us. Wabali Galeshka, Tatia Topa, Wakian, Pompewi, Hepiwi, Hamakochala. We always call on our ancestors and we thank them for our lives, for the heritage we've been given, for the beauty of the earth and the abundance of the earth. Women are the caretakers of the earth, grandmothers, and we always remember our ancestral grandmothers in the spirit world and how they have that beautiful connection with us, that we may do our work as grandmothers to care for our grandchildren and teach them the ways to walk the earth with them, to travel up and down the rivers to our gathering sites, to share the stories, the traditional old stories of where creation began. And so we're here today, grandmothers and grandfathers, to honor you and to ask for assistance for all of our women, the Indigenous women of the world, the leaders of the world. Grandmothers, our villages were always led by the women. We led in such a gentle and selfless manner, such a loving manner. And we're restoring these cultural traditions today, especially the foodways. We're restoring our cultural values of respect and honor, of humility, of compassion, so many things and so many qualities, so many stories. We're asking that we be able to pass these on to our grandchildren, our tomorrow's living museums, because this is our work of sharing from generation to generation. We just thank you for this day that you have given us to honor the Indigenous women of the earth. As we circle the globe and think of every single individual and every family, we honor them. We honor their ancestors. We honor the elders. We honor the youngs and the to be born. And so we just have this time today to work together to do great things on behalf of the people as we fulfill that prophecy that declared that the day will come where the people of the world will turn to the native people to find out how to care for the earth and to care for one another. I just say, Palamie, Wopila, Mitako Yeo Yasi.
Thank you, Elder Rose, for opening our event in a good way this morning. Even though we cannot be gathered in the same place today, you helped us bring our minds and hearts together. Thank you so much. Now it is my honor to introduce Mr. Vimlendra Sharan, Director of the FAO Liaison Office for North America in Washington, D.C. Mr. Sharan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Michaela. And greetings, friends from Washington, D.C., all of you who have joined us today to be a part of this webinar and to celebrate North Indian Indigenous women on the International Women's Day. Special word of thanks to all our keynote speakers and our panelists who have taken time out to be with us and share their ideas and views. Let me begin today's event by quoting a Sanskrit shlok from Manu Smriti, an ancient text, perhaps said to be dating back to 200 BC. In verse 56.3, Manu says, Yatra naryastu pujyante ramante tatra devta. Translated, it reads, gods reside only where women are valued. For me, this shlok really captures the timeless perspective of women. And yet, as we have hurtled through the millennia, humankind has chosen to ignore these wise words, and definitely to its own peril. The persistent discrimination they face, the violence, the inequality, and the systemic lack of recognition for their individual and collective rights have placed women, and especially the Indigenous women, in highly vulnerable situations. It is time to come together and to raise our collective voice to remedy this. Today, as we honor Indigenous women, let me remind the audience that Indigenous women are not only fundamental in their communities, They are relevant for the entire world. Their wisdom and perspective are central to the well-being and health of our planet and its population. Their human service in preserving biodiversity, mitigating climate change, and transforming food systems to make them sustainable must be recognized and saluted. Our Director General, Chu Dong-Hyu, in his message for this event and for the Indigenous women in North America writes, and I quote, "My greetings and best wishes to the Indigenous women all over the globe, and especially to those in North America, in honor and recognition of the exceptional contributions that they have made to sustain traditional food systems and lifestyles, and for being instrumental in enhancing food security and nutrition of the Indigenous communities." On its part, FAO has placed the work with Indigenous women as a fundamental priority, not only considering them recipients of technical assistance, but also working with them as equal partners. The Leadership School for Indigenous Women in more than 13 countries and the Global Campaign on Indigenous Women have contributed not only to develop the capacities of these women, but for many FAO staff also to learn from them and to ensure their seat at the table. Last year, our office here in North America, together with CARE USA, organized a food systems dialogue on gender equality and women's empowerment for food security and nutrition. It included a dedicated session on Indigenous women, and I am given to understand that it was the first food systems dialogue to have a special session dedicated to Indigenous women and their contributions. Let me share the 4 main recommendations that emerged from that session. First, ensure the full and effective participation of Indigenous women in decision-making processes, policy debates on food system, and climate change as knowledge holders. Promote research for, with, and by Indigenous women regarding their irreplaceable knowledge. Recognize their potential and stop categorizing Indigenous women as just a vulnerable population. Ensure Indigenous women do not remain invisible in relevant documents and processes, such as the voluntary guidelines on gender equality and women's empowerment in the context of food security and nutrition, including the 2021 UN World Food System Summit. I'm hopeful that today's event will help keep the spotlight shining on Indigenous women, their work, and their wisdom, and move the needle forward in creating more equitable and fair world for all. Allow me to close my remarks by completing the Sanskrit shlok with which I started. The second and the closing line of the shloka reads, Yatra istuna pujyante sarva satraphala kriya. It means, translated it reads, where women are not valued, no work will ever bear fruit. Let us resolve then to value them, respect them, recognize them, and honor them. With these words, I'll stop and pass the floor back to the moderators. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sharan, for your warm welcome and strong words to open our discussion in acknowledgement of International Women's Day. I invite us all now to turn our attention to a recorded message from Representative Deb Haaland, Congresswoman of New Mexico's 1st Congressional District, one of the first Native American women to be serving in Congress, and the first Native American woman to be nominated for a U.S. presidential cabinet as Secretary of the Department of the Interior. She is a 35th generation New Mexican as an enrolled member of the Pueblo of Laguna with Jimenez Pueblo heritage. You can see her full bio in the chat box. While Representative Haaland was not able to join in person today, she recorded this message for us.
Hi, everybody. I'm Deb Haaland, representative for New Mexico's 1st Congressional District and proud member of the Pueblo of Laguna. This Women's History Month is unlike any that came before it. Not only is the entire world grappling with the global pandemic, we're also seeing women taking the brunt of impacts from the economic downturn the pandemic caused. What we know is that Indigenous women are at the forefront of advocating for their communities around the globe. From fighting the impacts of climate change in the Amazon to ensuring their communities have access to critical healthcare services, Indigenous knowledge is key to addressing the interlocking crises that our world faces today. Pueblos are matrilineal societies. Women in our communities are leaders and carry the wisdom that passes down to our future generations. Growing up in my mother's Pueblo household made me fierce. Though I grew up in a military family, often moving across the country, I would spend summers with my grandparents in Mesita, one of the Laguna Pueblo's 6 villages, where we lived without running water or electricity. I would irrigate cornfields with my grandpa and watch my grandma through the kitchen window while she cooked bread, beans, and chili. Those experiences taught me to respect the earth and value our resources, whether it's protecting sacred sites or providing relief to those hit especially hard by the COVID-19 pandemic. My experiences and my deep connection to our Pueblo culture influenced my approach to leadership and policy making. For Women's History Month, I hope everyone takes a moment to learn more about Indigenous women who make incredible contributions to our world and how we can listen and learn from the wisdom they carry and the values they hold across the globe. Thank you so much.
Thank you to my colleagues for their coordination, and our thanks to Representative Haaland and her office for sharing that message with us this morning. I am honored to now introduce our distinguished speaker, Heather Dawn Thompson, Director of the Office of Tribal Relations at the U.S. Department of Agriculture. She is a member of the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe. Director Thompson holds a Juris Doctor cum laude from the Harvard Law School. She is an expert in American Indian law, tribal sovereignty, and rural tribal economic development. Please see her full bio in the chat box. Director Thompson, thank you for taking the time to join us today. The floor is yours.
Ihani Orste, Heather Dawn Thompson, Naish, Toshunka Hiziwi, Emachiapi. Malakota, Wakpa Washte, Yanke Himataha. I am so honored to be with you here today on Indigenous Women's Day, International Day. My name is Heather Dawn Thompson in English. My Lakota name is Toshunka Hiziwi, Yellow Buckskin Horsewoman. I am a citizen of the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe in South Dakota. I am speaking to you today from South Dakota, from the beautiful Black Hills. And as Michaela's pointed out, I'm the recent appointee to be the Director of the Office of Tribal Relations for the United States Department of Agriculture. A little bit about my background and why I'm so excited to have this position. I have a lot of farming and ranching in both sides of my family, but my personal passion is Indigenous foods and Indigenous wild medicinal plants specifically. And it's interesting to now be in this position with the United States government. As you can imagine, the United States has a very complex relationship with its Indigenous communities, as many of our countries do, and specifically with regard to agriculture. As many of you know, historically, as the United States expanded, the Indigenous people in the United States were in the way of that expansion, and specifically their wild foods. And so there was an effort, of course, at extermination in the United States. And when that was not successful, the focus became assimilation. And that meant assimilation of foodways as well. Many of you are aware of the efforts to destroy the bison in the west of the United States in an effort to force Indigenous communities onto what are now called Indian reservations. Many of our treaties actually have specific provisions in them with regard to agriculture. Sort of a promise, if you stop warring with the United States and fighting back, if you move to these Indian reservations and you become Western style agrarian communities, we will support you. We will provide funds and financing to help you become farmers and ranchers. We will purchase your foods and the produce that you make through these processes. And so the USDA, the United States Department of Agriculture, is the modern iteration of this treaty promise, of this government to government relationship that is completely unique, I would argue, in comparison to all the other federal agencies in the United States. And that relationship has been a complicated one. So I would argue the USDA has done quite a good job, particularly in recent years, in working with tribal nations. They have a sophisticated diplomatic relationship, as evidenced by the fact that they have an entire Office of Tribal Relations that is located directly under the Secretary that is responsible for that diplomatic relationship. And they have done a good job of incorporating tribal nations into their pre-existing programs. Unfortunately, most of those pre-existing programs, as you can imagine, are not Indigenous foodways focused. They are predominantly focused on monocropping and Western ranching methods and other Western forms of agriculture. And so one of my hopes and goals during the 4 years of this administration is to better incorporate Indigenous foodways and Indigenous goals into the United States government's Department of Agriculture. That in some cases is low-hanging fruit in some areas, and in other cases is quite complex. So one thing that my office will be doing, I think I'm a full 3 weeks into my job, so hopefully you'll give me some grace and timing on that. But one of the things that my office is hoping to do is do a full review of all the loans and grant programs that the USDA already has and see where we could make some tweaks so that things such as wild foods, seed sharing, Indigenous cropping, what we call today permaculture, right? How we can better incorporate that into the pre-existing programs that the United States government has. And one of the areas in which this is perhaps the most important, because it creates both a market and provides nutritional food in Indigenous communities, is a program that we call the Commodity Program, or FDIPR. You might have heard of that acronym before. And this is the nutrition program that is specifically focused on Indian reservations. And so in the very beginning, it had, 100 years ago, very poor nutritional quality, a lot of focus on carbohydrates and flour, and that has been one of the triggers for the extensive diabetes rate that we have in Indian country. Over the last 100 years, that food package has improved and improved and improved, and is generally of quite high quality now and has a lot of tribal participation in that. But what it doesn't have is a lot of integration of Indigenous foods. So we, the United States government, are feeding Indigenous communities without incorporating Indigenous foods. And that is difficult, as you guys know, having worked in government agencies, because how do we monetize some of these wild foods and Indigenous foods? Do we want to in the first place? How do we purchase on natural cycles rather than on federal government purchasing cycles? How do we purchase in smaller bites, right? Our Indigenous foods are not going to be grown or collected at federal purchasing levels. So how do we decentralize what the United States government has historically done at the federal level into local purchasing for those communities? And it's a difficult question, right? Because many times we are going to be giving up efficiencies, if you will, and cost efficiencies for long-term sustainability and for incorporation of better nutritional value and for supporting Indigenous goals and Indigenous foodways. So I think I'm coming up to the end here, but that was a couple things 3 weeks in I wanted to share with you, some of the things that we're thinking about in my office. And to frame it a little bit for you, the Biden administration, the current president of the United States, has highlighted as his top 4 priorities of addressing COVID, of course, and getting our economy back on track. So economic recovery is the second one. The third one is racial equity. And the fourth one is climate change. And my advocacy has been that there's no place in which these areas converge more than in Indian country, in Indigenous communities, and really specifically in our foodways. If you really want to talk about economic recovery, if you really want to talk about racial equity, if you really want to talk about long-term climate change, then we need to be shifting the way we think about agriculture, and we need to be reinvesting and focusing in Indigenous foodways. So I'll stop there. I thank you guys so much for your time. I'll stay on the line and I look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thank you so much, Director Thompson. I am so grateful for your advocacy and efforts within the USDA to help tribes on their journey towards food system sovereignty. We wish you and your colleagues all the best in the USDA Office of Tribal Relations, and I personally look forward to watching and following your future work. Thank you for joining us today. Our next speaker is an Indigenous scholar I've been following for many years in my studies and research. Her most recent publication, Indigenous Food System Concepts, Cases, and Conversations, is one I cite frequently. Dr. Priscilla Settee is a member of the Cumberland House Swampy Cree First Nation in Saskatchewan, Canada. She is a professor of Indigenous Studies at the University of Saskatchewan, where she teaches on Indigenous food sovereignty and Indigenous social economies. In addition, she is an accomplished author, a David Suzuki Fellow, and now a Research Fellow for the NDN Collective. Dr. Settee, it is my distinct honor and privilege to introduce you today. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, and thank you for the previous speakers and presenters that help set us up in a good way. I'm just going to pull up my PowerPoint here and see if it shares properly. I don't know if it's, can you see that? Does that come up?
Not yet, Dr. Settee.
Okay, so somebody said yes, but somebody said not yet. Okay, so let me just share the screen. Okay, this must come up now, yes?
Yes,
Okay.
you're all set.
I have 12 minutes to do a presentation that I will be teaching in May over the course of a regular session. So I'll move right into it quickly and note that, you know, people can get in touch with me after, or if you have questions in the chat, that'll be fine. So I'm really glad that the previous speaker mentioned the impact of climate change on Indigenous food and all food systems, because my most recent fellowship with the David Suzuki organization was strictly focusing on that and its impact on traditional economies and traditional Indigenous food systems. In my other job as adjunct professor at the Natural Resources Institute at the University of Manitoba, I'm kept up to date with the research of young scholars on Indigenous food systems. So I'm really happy to serve in that role, because I find that a lot of the work that the young scholars and community activists, people growing on the ground, are making huge improvements and are also leading the way in many ways. So I applaud my young students and other scholars for their work, including some of the young women on this organizing committee. I'm also a fabric artist, so my art focuses on traditional Cree art forms with a contemporary focus on preserving biodiversity and knowledge. And this comes from a long line of activism within Convention on Biological Diversity and other community-based initiatives that have taken place really since the UN Sustainable Development Conference that took place in Rio de Janeiro back in 1992. So, you know, my colleagues and myself have been working for a long time on really pulling concerns of communities and trying to make the bridge between community and scholars or the universities, so that we are not just people acting blindly in our research, but really honoring our roots and our knowledge bases. So my research throughout these past several decades that focuses largely on Indigenous knowledge systems, including from South Africa, South America, the Philippines, South Pacific, Vanuatu, Hawaii, Peru, Bolivia, India, Asia, where I worked and researched with scholarly and community-based groups. So the topic of Indigenous knowledge systems is legion and large and so overdue to be represented within higher learning, not to give other scholars access to our intellectual property rights, because that indeed has been a really thorny issue of, but really recognizing the gifts that our peoples possess and how to honor them without taking advantage of them. So this research has resulted in one of my earlier books called Imatsuin, which in my language is The Good Life. And here I talk about the Indigenous global knowledge systems. An earlier book, but was republished, is another book of women's stories called Aki Memok, which in my language means tenacity, the ability of women to keep on going despite some of the most horrific situations some of our communities find ourselves in. And then lastly, as was mentioned, my most recent book on Indigenous food systems that is co-edited by my colleague, Dr. Shayla Shukla from the University of Winnipeg. And we incidentally have just sent the letters out for our follow-up book to this, which will be an international Indigenous food system book that should be produced in 2021. There's a picture of the latest book, Indigenous Food Systems. And here on the front, we see this artwork was done by my cousin, and we see women making pamigan. So the role of women is absolutely essential in the pursuit of food sovereignty, food security, food systems. Bimatsuin, the previous book that focuses on those knowledge systems, and Aki Memok, The Strength of Women. So those are 3 books that all with the same artist, you might note. So I am going to mention as kind of a thesis to my talk that for me, food justice is the most important struggle today. And why? Because it encompasses land, water, intellectual property rights, genocide, current and historical challenges, governance systems, women and children's rights. And it has the capacity to unite global populations to really make a difference. And it's something that is premised on Indigenous knowledge systems because we Indigenous people represent in large part all of the innovations in the world's food systems. But today we are faced, as a previous speaker mentioned, a health crisis that is based on a food crisis and development crises that is largely centered around something called food justice, which is precipitated and has its origins in the environmental crises that we face today. So our current food system is hugely industrial. It's heavily reliant on pesticides, herbicides, Western science, large-scale methods of production, as well as the loss of local autonomy and small farming communities. So these are all the things that my research has taught me, that we are on the precipice of a disaster that largely around the disappearance of species and other life forms. So what can be done? What is the role of health and education, policy, legislators, etc.? And how can we build coalitions of solidarity to address challenges? For indeed, that is the only thing that will work, by educating each other and by working in solidaritous action. And my own community of Cumberland House is a really prime example. And I write a lot about my community, the impact that a large dam had on the biodiversity of my community. And my David Suzuki research, which is now complete, talks about how the trappers from my Cree community told me stories about the impact of this development on our food sources. So within my community, I've been foundationally involved in the community garden movement over 15 years ago. And this is a series of urban gardens where we work with local communities to pay attention to the foods we're eating and who produces those foods, how they're produced. As well as that, over the last few decades, I've organized several international Indigenous knowledge conferences, 2 or 3 of them which focused on food systems. And these conferences attracted, people from all over the globe. I was very surprised, but I there realized how many people are so interested in this topic and are doing something about it. Within my Department of Indigenous Studies, my research includes not only Indigenous food sovereignty, land and water, but also the important issue of what's happening to our youth and some of the work that they are doing. We have a huge problem with gang-related challenges in our city, in our communities. And largely, I believe it is related to the lack of purpose that our youth have been dealt. And so I have worked with gang exiting members and put that into research. And my research also includes Indigenous and feminist research methodology, and ultimately the impact of globalization on Indigenous peoples. So I start this work out by examining what does Indigenous knowledge bring to food sovereignty? What are the origins of the world's foods? And what are the important values that still remain in communities like Wahotowin, a concept of we are all related, we are family, Bimatsuin, the good life, how to maintain, how to reflect in our actions, in our research, in our daily living, that good life that reflect, the care for the not only humans, but the natural world as well. I talk about Indigenous peoples' contribution that include, thousands of species of corn and oca and potatoes that are really disappearing, have disappeared greatly over the last few decades. And, it's estimated that we lose about 200 species a year. That's what science is telling us. There's something very important called the human or the peasant food systems versus the chain. The peasant food systems reflecting that knowledge that's based largely by women, by small peasant farmers, by Indigenous peoples, versus the industrial chain of food production. And this is really astounding when you listen to the statistics on both food systems. And we learn that the peasant food system is a lot more lucrative and productive than the actual large scale production. But a lot of these facts are not acknowledged in formal education. And a lot of our research departments of agriculture pursue the highly sustainable, mechanized, industrial mode of production. And we need to do something about that. As scholars, as policymakers, we need to work together and address what the previous speaker told us. On top of that, if that wasn't enough, we also have worked with other scholars who have described in detail early government policies that deliberately undermined Indigenous food sovereignty. Professor James Daschuk in 2013 talked about the intentional disappearance of the buffalo on Plains people, the impact. We also understand and work with and describe some of the early unethical food experiments that is still having lasting impact in the form of diabetes. A lot of these tests were, required Indigenous people to literally be starved or go without dental care, just so Western scientists could gain huge accolades in their research trajectory. So I talk about this in my course on food sovereignty, that we have business to take up with the government of today based on their actions of yesteryear that were hugely unethical and problematic then and remain so today. So in the face of all this, Indigenous peoples have been developing phenomenal declarations about their communities and food sovereignty. And I refer to one called the Nyaleni in 2007 at the International Forum of Food Sovereignty in Mali, West Africa. Here in Canada, the People's Food Policy. Here in my province, the Saskatchewan Food Charter, and based out of Africa, the No Patents on Life statement that is brilliant and really needs to be read by everybody. So because of development in our communities, as was mentioned before, we are facing huge stressors related to health, well-being, change of local economies, traditional economies. And these parallel stressors within a wider world includes the disappearances of small farmers and local food producers, and at the same time that the global decline in farmers parallels the direct growth of multinational agribusinesses. And that's something to be very concerned about. For example, in the 2018 Living Planet report, it reported that global wildlife populations have fallen by 60% in the last 4 decades. We see it here in our backyard, in our communities as well. The movement and disappearance of large animal that we rely on. The clear cuts that impact the movement of these animals continue to go on. The disappearance of the beautiful peat systems of cleansing land and water that is currently being mined by large outside companies. And people on our lands are simply desperate and really wanting to bring these terrible conditions to the forefront. In Canada, mammal populations have dropped by a high percentage, the same with amphibian and reptile population, fish populations, and some types of birds. The elders talk about, we don't even hear the birds in our community anymore. So this is not just me speaking about it, but this is actually based on scientific research. And this is a very important slide about, in terms of the mainstream food systems, how so many varieties have just disappeared. Like a century ago, for example, there was 497 varieties of lettuce. And if you go down to the bottom today, there is 36. And the same with beets, radishes, squash, tomatoes, etc. You can see how in this diagram, how they've shrunk the number of varieties that are available due to the monopolization of food and control over that. And I talk a lot about the impact of Western development, and this is not news to many of the people listening. The dams, the mines, the clear cuts, the oil explorations, the nuclear bomb test sites, and military installations have ruined traditional harvesting, hunting, and fishing communities. Here in the north of my province, we have a huge tract of land that is lucrative hunting and trapping area, and it's now a bombing range. And this was unilaterally decided by previous governments. Alberta's tar sands have been called the most destructive project on the world's traditional lands, and the toxic holding ponds that hold the refuse from the tar sands are so big and so deadly, they can be seen from the sky by satellite. And our people are being criminalized. Our people are not only being criminalized, but our people are also being murdered for standing up for land rights. And I'm referring to the Berta Cáceres movement out of Honduras. Berta was killed at her doorstep by armed gunmen because she was talking the way I'm talking today. And so our colleagues have established the Berta Cáceres Feminist Training School to address the horrible situation that too many of our women find ourselves in. And I'm talking in Canada where, you know, there's probably close to 2,000 women that have been murdered and disappeared, but still the state has done virtually nothing to address this. Here's a picture of the clear cuts just close to where I have some land. And one of the founders of Idle No More, Sylvia McAdam, that's her father on the top right-hand picture, staring out in disbelief at his trap line. And this is land that provided for him and his family. And you can see all the logs lined up by the side of the road. It's a massacre. There's no other way to describe it. It's our homelands, and it's being disappeared by the state in partnership with companies, outside companies. And who's standing up to it? The women. Here is a picture of a Mi'kmaq woman, and in the background is the army. So we're not just saying this on our own, but more than 15,000 scientists from 184 countries have issued the warning that humankind must take immediate action to reverse the effects of climate change, deforestation, and a species extinction before it's too late. And, you know, every year, I believe the Alliance of Scientists for Accountability take out another statement and talking about how many more species we have lost. My own mentor, David Suzuki, said at a talk that he gave here on my campus that humanity by 2050 may be disappeared by half of the world's population, and that by 2100, we may be extinct ourselves. This is a shocking prediction. And, you know, we cannot talk about food sovereignty without addressing the state of the water. And in my research and teaching, I talk about, you know, the fact that in Canada, with so many hundreds of boil water advisories, we have to act quickly with everyone feeling the same desperation that we have. So here are some pictures of the tar sands in northern Alberta. And, you know, our government insists on expanding this pipeline. And even though south of the border in South Dakota, you know, young people have been criminalized. Our CEO of the Indian Collective has had charges for defying this kind of treatment of land. And here's a picture of the proposed pipeline that's going right through my province. And so our people move to the urban in search of food, in search of housing, and shockingly, in our 6 lowest income neighborhoods where my family works, the magnitude of the disparity in health outcomes found in my city of Saskatoon is shocking for a city of the Western world. Infant mortality rate in Saskatoon's lowest income neighborhoods is 448% higher than the suburbs where predominantly non-Indigenous people live. So this is old research. I don't believe that the data or statistics have changed qualitatively, but it's shocking. It's worse than so-called third world countries. Close to 2.5 million Canadians are food insecure. Farmers and fishers are going out of business, and our natural environment is really being pushed to the limit. And I always say that, you know, the treatment of women in our country is parallel to the treatment of nature. But on top of that, here is hope. And this is a picture of the 2,000-year-old Batak terraces in the Philippines, where I walked a few years ago with people from Igorot, people from the Philippines. And the breathtaking beauty of these terraces that have remained culturally intact, biodiversely intact, was really a good shot in the arm for me. You know, and this work we know is allowed to happen, encouraged to happen because of the international trade agreements and government policies that the United States, Canada, all the developed regions propose and benefit from. And I tell my students that if we are to change things, we must understand the magnitude of the power of the multinational agricultural organizations that are backed up by these international monetary funds, the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, and their structural adjustment programs. So it's, you know, while we talk about food security, food sovereignty locally, we must see it within the broader framework of a governance policy that is totally anti-people. And we must ask the question, who is in control of production and distribution of our foods, which is how we get to the issue of food justice and what is going to happen into the future. And my research also looks at the number of killings that happen because of agribusiness and oil and mining industry interests superseding Indigenous rights to their traditional lands. It's absolutely shocking when we look at the statistics of death of Indigenous people globally. I can't underestimate it. I just can't overestimate it, rather. So I know that I'm going over my time now. So I will close with maybe some words of encouragement, because I think it's devastating to hear all the negative, and I don't focus only on the negative, because we need to feel a sense of hope. We need to endorse and honor the concept of our food as a relative and the sacred relationship, but also to recognize how that contrasts with, you know, how Western science views food only for economic gain. And in responses to some of the things that previous speakers said, the high incidence of diabetes and brought on by destruction of traditional lands and rapid lifestyle changes, these are all reasons for asking and challenging people to become food sovereignists. And the other reason is a lot of this movement is being led by women of the world. Why? Because we nourish our communities and our families. And so that's why we recognize this work today. So once we become food activists, we join the global movement. There is a very live global food sovereignty movement that is reclaiming democratic practices and questioning these very neoliberal policies that I described. So it's a reinvention of the concept of democracy, which is at the heart of all Indigenous nations. Here's a lovely picture of some of our northern caribou, which are in, some of them have gone extinct. Some of these herds have gone extinct, but some of them haven't. So we must view this work within the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We must look to the local movements to get inspired, because all over the world where I've been working with people, people have the knowledge. We just need to figure out how to work together more effectively and realize that we may be endangered for speaking our truth. So I want to close with the 6 food principles, food sovereignty principles. And this is developed by the La Via Campesina group, which many of you would be familiar with, that food sovereignty focuses on food for people, that it values food providers, those people who grow our lettuce and carrots and tomatoes, who are sometimes brought in from developing regions of the world so that we may eat and are forced to live in the most terrible living conditions with no citizen right benefits that the rest of, in Canada, for example, are accorded. That it works to localize food systems so that we don't feel like we need to bring fruit from Central and South America just to have foods. That it also puts control locally, that we have a say in how our food is produced so it'll be free from poisons that harm people. So when we're in control locally, we have more control on how our foods, whether they're safe or not. It builds knowledge and skills, so we make it part of the daily curriculum. We teach little kids from a very early age, and really these are our, foundational principles. It works with nature. It doesn't say, okay, so we need scientific monitoring, or science is good in some things, but a lot of times Indigenous people have said, why do we need to manipulate genes to produce a redder apple or whatever, an apple that doesn't go brown, for example. And so we need to really approach science with a little bit of inquiry, even more inquiry. And finally, that food sovereignty is very much different from food security. Food security meaning, we will produce more and more and more food, but we need to question and who's producing it, who's controlling it. So in closing, I want to just say that I really appreciate forums like this. There's 800 people listening. There's this fine team of women who've put this together using their power and influence to educate and to listen. And I want to thank everybody for doing that. And I'm going to stay on and listen to some questions. Thank you very much.
Dr. Settee, thank you. I know that we're just scratching the surface with your research and your knowledge and your expertise. And I thank you for sharing what's semesters and years work of work within a very short amount of time. And thank you for joining us today, for showing us your work both within your community and at an international scale, and inspiring us to join you in this food justice movement that's so critical, and for showing us the importance of building coalitions of solidarity. And it's a great honor to listen and learn from you, and thank you for educating us today. And I hope that everyone in the audience will continue to learn from your work in your recent publications, as well as your forthcoming one in 2021. And I wish you all the best in that work forthcoming. Thank you for staying on, and I'm sure there'll be more questions to come your way. Now I invite us to turn our attention towards the panelists that have joined us today. And I'd also like to acknowledge and thank the Ambassador Bugaliski for joining us. It's a great honor for you to be here today and to join us. Ambassador Bugaliski will be offering her reflections after our panel of speakers. She is the Canadian ambassador for the Rome-based agencies and also the chair of the Group of Friends in Rome. Ambassador, thank you for joining us, and we look forward to your remarks after our panel. Today, we are joined by a panel of distinguished speakers who will expand upon all that we have been discussing so far. We will go through a first round of introductions and then a second round of questions for each of our panelists. Thank you, Beth, Elisa, and Mariana for joining today. Beth Roach, I pass the floor to you for introductions.
Beth Roach, Nottoway Tribe of Virginia. I'm a water protector, a seed protector and keeper, and I'm a story keeper. And I'm thrilled to be here today with all of who have spoken before and all of you all. And I look forward to getting more into my remarks, I'm so drawn to just have a moment of grief for the pictures that Dr. Settee showed us. And I'm being asked to share our Haudenosaunee Thanksgiving address. So we were Iroquois people in Nottoway, and I'll just give you the top 3 lines. Yukare huadase igwehegwe one jukaktikekwa, yukare huadase ine honroach one jukaktikekwa, yukare huadasa awe one jukaktikekwa. So we are so grateful for the people, Egwehegwe, Inea Honroach, our land, and Awa, our water, that's connecting all of us. And so with that, we are one mind, and I look forward to continuing this conversation with you all. Nawe.
Nawe, Beth, and we are so grateful that you can join us today. Elisa, over to you.
Ani Bojo, Dishna Kaz, Wabi Bishkiki. My name is Elisa Levi, and it is my honor today to join you from the traditional territory of the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation. I am so fortunate to be beside water as we speak today, beside beautiful Georgian Bay, and to have thinking about my remarks that'll come shortly and the words that were set by speakers before. It's a strange place where we are, right? But it's also beautiful. And that message of hope that Dr. Priscilla Settee set, I hope to continue some of those, visionings in my talk later. So thank you for having me, and thanks to everybody on this beautiful International Indigenous Women's Day.
Elisa, thank you so much for joining us. We're grateful you can be here. Mariana, over to you.
Thank you very much, Michaela. It is a great honor to be here today sharing the panel with amazing speakers, and we really look forward to listen to their message. Also, I'm very glad to hear the presentation of the previous speakers. My name is Mariana Estrada. I am part of the FAO Indigenous Peoples Unit. My main work is on Indigenous women and biocentric restoration, but I will be presenting today some of the activities that the unit, the complete unit, is pushing and developing to support Indigenous women, and particularly to support Indigenous women in food systems or in relation to food security.
Thank you so much, Mariana. Beth, we'll go back to you with the first question. In your work as a seed keeper and a water keeper and a story keeper for the Nottoway tribe, and in your different roles of leadership, I was wondering if you would be willing to expand more upon the core complexities and the relationships and the needs that you're seeing, as well as what trajectories are you paying attention to? And I know that you also mentioned wanting to offer a moment for the pictures and words that Dr. Settee shared with us. So over to you.
It's incredible to share this space with all y'all. And I'm coming to you from Richmond, Virginia. So that's on what is now known as the James River, which for many years has been touted as the founding river of America and the United States. There's a lot of folks that would push back on that, and we have. And so in my lifetime, I grew up staring at Jamestown Island from right across the river from there. I currently live in Eastern North Carolina, very close to Site X, where the first attempt at English settlement was attempted. And throughout my life, I've lived as an other, as a Native woman, as a Nottoway woman, with my story not being told. We were in the shadow of the history of Jamestown and the Powhatan Confederacy. I was, in the shadows of this Confederacy is emblematic of so many tribal groups all over. So I know exactly what it feels like to be not seen in the major narrative. So even just being on this panel today and representing any sort of Mid-Atlantic tribal group is quite an honor and a big deal. And a lot of that is because, like so many of you know throughout the world, that we are responding to impacts of colonialism, and it depends on what timeline we're on. So for us, late 1500s, early 1600s, that's when the European invasion started to happen, and that directly impacts how our tribal groups were able to exist up until now and survive and thrive. So I was born in early 80s. I was born, living on the James River, which was heavily contaminated from Keepone. So you couldn't fish out of the waters. You weren't supposed to, but a lot of people did. And now it's one of the most pristine water riversheds in the country. And because of, what we see, what we've been hearing is like, you need policy change and you need government regulations and you need people to have their voices at the table. And so I've seen what it's like to have a watershed be resilient in nature. And it takes all these arms of people and it takes all these stories. And I've also seen in my lifetime this amazing resilience of our cultural native tribal groups in Virginia and North Carolina, where we are coming out of 200 years of occupation from the British Crown. And so we had treaties with the Crown that played heavily into how we were moved and lost land. And then we have 200 years of existence within the United States. And I can tell you from the Nottoway perspective, our reservation lands are, we are still living within and around them, but we've had to buy back a lot of our land as it was dismantled. A lot of the impacts came from breaking apart our communal living and how we could share land and how we could help to support each other. And a lot of that came through our agricultural food systems. And so some of the earliest records are our Nottoway women protesting how the land was being dealt with. Not that it was in our control of how we were, dealing with our land. That's a misconception. We were responding to the systems that were putting in place from us, but it was the women early on that were saying, we don't like this land being parceled out. We need to keep it together. And from that breakdown, I emerged into the 1900s when I was born, and this is now, beyond the Civil War in the Southeast, especially in our lands. Then you have the impacts of Jim Crow, and this racial equity piece is so important to recognize within Indigenous cultures and communities that, we got further detached from the system because of just the structures that upheld white supremacy and still does. And a lot of that is really tied to the control of the land. Like once you don't have land, you're not necessarily considered an Indigenous community anymore. So that's a lot, so I'm also a public historian, my degree's in history, so I could go on all day about all of those things, but how does that play into the world that I see now? So I'm so blessed to be, post Native American Religious Freedom Acts in 1978. It was still, not legal for us technically to gather and be who we are. But I'm lucky to have been born in an era that saw lots of reorganization of our tribal communities. And in Virginia and North Carolina, that means either you're state recognized or you're federally recognized. And in some cases, you're not recognized. And there's, unfortunately, this class system of recognition statuses within tribal groups. And so I'm so inspired to see these programs happening on the federal level, and yet, they're not applicable to so many of our communities because of recognition statuses. So we're dealing with a lot of systematic things that seem super overwhelming, and they are, and we have to have players within that field to make sure that we are navigating and Representative Deb Haaland, like it's amazing to have her in the power position that she's in. And there's so much hope knowing that the Secretary of Interior is going to be really aware of these sensitivities. And at the same time, we have this strong desire of many of our communities to return to our ancestral ways, to really revitalize these life ways that we are holding so dear. And so in order to do that, we have to work together. We have to reclaim our knowledge, and we have to, just lean into that as hard as we can. And we have to support each other with that knowledge. And so and at the same time, we have these really horrible threats. This climate crisis situation is coming at us at such an alarming rate. And when you look at Indigenous communities, especially, you're always looking, if it's a pipeline, for instance, it's going to be, impacting our lands and our waters and so always we're looking at that. Well, those are our ancestral grounds. Those are our burial, sites. These are our, that's the resource part of that. But it's also the threat of what any kind of pipeline burst or any kind of climate crisis impact is going to have on our food systems. And so what I see so much is that our activists, our women and our families that are on the ground really working against these systems are all seed keepers. Like we all started to realize that we were all doing the same work, that if you are looking at your cultural revitalization, if you're looking at food sovereignty, feeding your families healthy food, you're also really looking at your traditional systems and your seeds. And, speaking from a person that knows what it's like to not have your history in the narrative, so many of our seeds that are out there that have been commercialized or are familiar to so many people have lost their origin stories. So not only is it reclaiming the seeds and keeping them at healthy levels, but it's also reconnecting those stories of the seeds. And the best people to do that are the communities themselves. And so there's massive efforts to return seeds to ancestral communities and have them help grow that out. And then in turn, that's helping the communities learn these critical advocacy skills that we need in order to engage on federal, state, any kind of policy level. We have to know how to do that. And that's really difficult for tribal communities. I serve on my tribal council, and I can tell you that we, try hard to do the right thing, but we don't know enough. And so the Alliance of Native Seedkeepers is what we've built, and what it's emerging. So it's going to grow, but we are responding to what we know, that we have to do all these things in real time. Like we have to respond to the climate crisis. We have to get seeds into the hands of these communities. We have to go beyond recognition politics. And we also have to adapt to our traditional ecological knowledge to what we know is about to come down the road. So we know that in 80 years, our systems and our environments are going to look much differently. What's growing well in North Carolina is going to start to grow well in Maryland. And we've got to share those knowledge bases with each other so that we can continue to protect the seeds as they go forward. I could go on and on about corn, but I don't think we have enough time about how hard it is to grow corn and how important it is for us to grow corn, and how those varieties are difficult to grow near each other for cross-contamination reasons. And so, there's a lot of work to do, but I can tell you that what excites me is that we have women on the ground that are ready to do this. You might not see them always because they are homeschooling their kids and they are taking care of their families and they're working several jobs. Many folks are working several jobs. And so I feel like I'm just one person telling you from the ground that there's a lot of really incredible work. And if you have an opportunity to support organizations that are doing direct support, please support them. Nottoway, I'll step back now. I'm excited to hear everybody else.
Yeah, thank you so much, Beth. That was a really lovely intro and great answer to that question. Elisa, as somebody who is also interested in the intersection of public health, food, nutrition, health policy, and Indigenous-led initiatives, would you be willing to expand upon your work with the Indigenous Peoples Reliance Fund and your other collaborations?
Yeah, definitely. So Beth, I'm energized by your stories of seeds and the work that you're doing. And I mean, it's powerful, right? And like you said, it's changing the way we can look forward, and just by collecting our knowledge before and having that belief in our foodways. So yes, I'm going to, I have to start with a story, and that's just how my mind works. I'm really grateful for this opportunity to sit here and to lift women to their respective places within our food systems and acknowledge the role that women have played in COVID-19 as leaders and the way forward. As a young woman, I saw the power of food in health. I was mentored by women. I pursued a career in dietetics and nutrition, and I worked primarily at a population level. So it has been and has always been centering food that's guided my work, the work that I've been involved in, the work that I've taken time away from family to participate in. And, I want to talk about a couple areas that I think are emergent and really important today. And one that I reflect on is food and healthcare. And I recall one of my first roles working was in the Yukon at Whitehorse General Hospital. I helped for a couple years to coordinate a traditional diet program. And at one moment I was interviewed about the food that we provided to patients in Indigenous patients in the hospital. And this was a unique program. And I think today it still is a unique program because of all the policies that are around food, right? Providing traditional foods in healthcare. We know that there are issues with that, right? Because of policies that are, and that's a conversation for another call. But I had put a call out to say, you know, we were low on provisions. And quickly, I think the immediate Monday after this talk aired, 100 fish showed up at the hospital. And, you know, this food couldn't be used because of the policies that are in place, but the food was sacred. The food was caught by a local traditional fisherman. It was to be shared with the hospital. Anyways, me and my food expert knowledge, you know, I was trained, I was a dietitian, I had, you know, all this training around food. I didn't know what to do with this 100 fish, and for certain it wasn't going to be wasted. But it was the women in the program who stood up and who helped to fillet those 100 fish in that day and found families to take the fish, right? I share this story because I believe often in our foodways, when we ask for help, people come forward, those with the skills and knowledge that are able to participate and help. Also, there comes at a cost sometimes, right? So there's also resources that come forward. And I want to talk a little bit about the Indigenous Food Resilience Fund. This was an initiative that was created by two women in Canada who you know, took this opportunity through COVID to seek resources to advance issues that were meaningful to Indigenous communities so that communities could respond to COVID-19 and the challenges on their terms. And I'll share a little bit about that. You know, so there's a huge opportunity in food and healing and food and healthcare, one that connects climate change and helps understand the waste around all that food. So I do think women will lead that forward, and there's still much to be explored in that area. So that's something I think in my studies in medicine right now, I'm so fortunate to be on a second career and studying medicine and retooling and building skills as an Indigenous woman who can contribute to this continued space. Dr. Settee talked about her book. I contributed a chapter to that book. It was, the chapter title is Indigenous Philosophies and Perspectives on Traditional Food Systems, including Food and Culture, Maintaining Food Security in Elsipogtog First Nation. And that's the community that I'm from. I'm also from the Chippewas of Nawash, where I shared. I'm joining you from today. And my ancestors were part of the Potawatomi migration that ended up landing here in Nawash and continued to live here. So I authored that case study example, but the story was not mine. In fact, you know, that research took place in 2006. And why I was so happy to contribute that chapter to that book was because in 2018, I went back and said, what did you do with that research? You know, I worked and wanted to give back to my community. So I did my Master's of Public Health in the community. And, you know, they gave me a list of all the things that they had done, and much of that work led by women. But it really shows that, you know, there are barriers that you can focus on. There are time-stamped issues, much of like what we're going to be looking at during COVID-19, food access issues, but it's the work that happens as a result of that challenge we're faced with. And every single person has talked about it already. And I'm interested in how women will continue to change this, right? So I'm going to share a little bit about the Indigenous Peoples Resilience Fund. I've worked over the years to connect causes to people, to participate in philanthropy and meaningfully adjust funds that can go to work with Indigenous peoples on their terms, as I've said. But this fund was spearheaded by Victoria Grant and Wanda Broscopé in Canada. And what I think is so special about that, it was launched as an Indigenous effort. We sought philanthropic support in Canada to support these goals. And since June 2020 to February 2021, there's been 134 projects that have been funded in Indigenous-led and not community-specific, not band-specific, although bands do apply, but groups who organize them around themselves to address COVID. And 55% of these projects were food related, supporting food sovereignty work, supporting food security work, and a large number of these initiatives within that 55% were led by Indigenous women, and not only just women, but matriarchs in community put forward applications. Some called their proposals in. It wasn't a big lengthy process. You know, they'd get on the phone, call their idea in, and it was funded. And this fund didn't exist. You know, it didn't exist before. It was women who stepped forward and through leadership and brought other people on board to address issues that were important, and food came forward, as food always does, because food in a way connects us, but it also divides us, right? There's inequities in our food system that have been talked about already. And I think, you know, even in my own personal experience in medicine, as I've described, I will continue to center myself around food and those opportunities as a physician, working with my community, you know, how we can bring and use the strength of our food systems knowledge in our health. So all my relations, thank you for having me today, and I'm happy to participate in this conversation.
Thank you so much, Elisa, for sharing the stories and for sharing the stories of the Indigenous Peoples Resilience Fund and the leadership of the women who brought that forth, and now the response and what you said about the work that happens as a result of the challenges we face. So thank you for sharing a window of that with all of us today. Mariana, I look to you now for a question about the initiatives that the FAO has been leading to focus on empowering Indigenous women, their leadership and their advocacy skills, and their central contributions to intact food systems. And I'm wondering if you would be willing to expand on these FAO initiatives and the connections that you see to the forthcoming UN Food Systems Summit in October 2021. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Micaela. I will share a presentation. Let me just open here the screen. Let me know, now you can see it, no? Thank you very much, and I'm very glad to be sharing ideas with the panel and building on the message that the previous speakers has just shared. So I want to start by focusing on the UN Food Systems Summit 2021 that is upcoming, that will take place in October or at the end of the year, this year. This is a global initiative led by the United Nations Secretary General, with the objective of finding solutions that could transform food systems toward more sustainable food systems at a global level. Because what we have realized is that we will not achieve the global agenda, the Sustainable Development Goals, if we do not have more sustainable food systems. And today and this year, the world is moving a lot of energy and is gathering efforts and coordinating a lot of institutions to find a way to move to more sustainable food systems, meaning more efficient, inclusive, and resilient food systems. But what we need to keep in mind is that we will not achieve more efficient or sustainable food systems if we do not address the gender inequalities, and particularly Indigenous women challenge, the challenge that they are facing to achieve this goal, or to contribute to the sustainability of food systems. We are talking about, at global level, of more than 240 million Indigenous women. So this number exceeds the total population of countries like Nigeria, Brazil, or Pakistan. And we are talking that these countries are among the most populated ones in the world. And what we have here today is that Indigenous women have a strong participation in all the different dimensions of food systems. And I would like to highlight that my colleagues in the team, Micaela, John, and Brunel, are working very hard to study and profile Indigenous food systems to provide information on the resilient and elements or the sustainable elements of food system. And what we have discovered, what we have found out is that the indigenous people food system are a holistic system, and as the previous speaker just shared, where knowledge, land management, natural resources, languages, all is interconnected. So when we are, the problem is that when women are facing a lot of disproportionate challenges, they cannot realize their full potential to contribute to these food systems. And we will not have sustainable food systems if we do not address and focus this disproportionate challenge that we are hearing today, that the previous speakers, Beth, Elisa, that are sharing today. So we are talking that indigenous women are facing the challenges of accessing the land, of respecting the recognition of the right, the recognition of them as indigenous peoples, and at the same time are facing challenges as women, like they are still facing a continuous episode of sexual violence, domestic violence, invasion of their territories, and all these challenges become a net and are interconnected. And this creates a different way to experience inequality. And we need to understand that if we do not address the whole net of challenges, we will not enhance indigenous women contribution to food system, and per consequence, the food system. So what FAO is doing? This is the pillar of work of FAO's work plan with indigenous peoples. It was drafted in 2015 with a caucus of indigenous leaders. And you can see that since the first day, indigenous women are a focus area of the work of FAO with indigenous peoples. One, we are ensuring that indigenous women are participating and well represented among all the activities that are developed under the different pillars of work of FAO with indigenous peoples, but also across the activities of all the organization. In addition, and as Mr. Vimlendra said at the beginning, we are pushing, we have two main initiatives: the Leadership Schools of Indigenous Women and the Global Campaign. The Leadership School of Indigenous Women is a beautiful project that looks to provide tools to indigenous women leaders to engage in policy debate, not to create leaders, because indigenous women we have here are leaders themselves, are leading already processes within their communities. But sometimes they need some tools to engage in policy debate, in decision-making processes. So through this program, it's a 2 or 3 weeks program that we implement in different countries and also at regional level. We partner always with an indigenous organization, local indigenous organization, a national institution, and FAO. And what we do is that we adapt the content of this leadership school to the reality of indigenous women in that region or in that country. So in this case, we can focus on the real problems that they are facing. So for example, we're talking that in Latin America and in North America, indigenous peoples and indigenous women are moving more and more to the cities due to the climate change, due to the deterioration of the resources, the natural resources in their territories, also because of the invasion of their territories. So they are now becoming urban dwellers, and they have different challenges to face than other indigenous women in other regions, where they are still remaining in rural areas in their territories, but where their rights are not being recognized. The second initiative is the Global Campaign for the Empowerment of Indigenous Women. This is the response of FAO to the direct demand of indigenous women to the UN system to create initiatives that help them to break the invisibility that they are facing within policy-making processes. So what we create is the initiative of the violet chair as an icon of the place of indigenous women in policy-making decisions. So we made an open call to organizations, university, governments to develop activities and raise awareness of the importance of Indigenous women representing themselves in policy-making processes. And you can see there the map of around 15 countries that develop different activities, having violet chairs, painting chairs, creating social media campaigns, or collaborations with influencers and chefs. And we also gather more than 90 supporter organizations. Here you can see the logos of the organizations. And finally, last year, in April 2020, we launched an open consultation for Indigenous women with the aim of gathering their views and perspective on how to update the curricula of the Indigenous Women Leadership School. And we include this open question that you see there. What are Indigenous women main concerns? And we found that the most of frequent comments and ideas were around leadership, how Indigenous women could enhance their participation in decision-making processes, not just in their communities, but also at global level, because at the end, these global debates are affecting their communities. Tenure of land, as Dr. Priscilla said, the scarcity of water, it's a real concern of Indigenous women, climate change, but also they share their concern of the many challenges that they are facing today to transmit their knowledge, their food systems, their languages to Indigenous youth and to children. So what we are suggesting and when we are trying to promote is that now that the UN Food System Summit, through their different action tracks, they are designing and finding game-changing solutions to ensure that the transformation of food systems toward more sustainable food systems. And what we are calling is that these game-changing solutions include key actions to address Indigenous women inequalities within food systems. And we are proposing six main key actions that are based, as my colleague Beth said, Indigenous people's rights are the basis of their access to land, their relation to their natural resources. So this is one of the main important elements. Ensure Indigenous women knowledge and work is respected, include, preserved, and valued. And I remember last week I was in an event with Indigenous women from South Asia, and one Indigenous leader said that I have knowledge of my community. I have lived here in this territory all my life, and I know how to produce food here, and I know how to respond to different climate situations or shocks, but I don't have a certification because she didn't went to university. And she said, so my knowledge is not valuable to contribute to the debates or the decision-making processes. So we need to start changing this idea that Indigenous women knowledge is not real knowledge, or that Indigenous women work is not real work, because if not, we will be always missing one element for the transformation of food systems. We also call to improve disaggregated data to contribute to reduce the invisibility of Indigenous women, to break this invisibility in policy making processes. We promote and we encourage to promote policy and capacity building process to empower and support Indigenous women to engage in policy debate, the active and effective participation of Indigenous women in decision-making processes, and the respect of Indigenous people's right to free, prior, and informed consent, ensuring that Indigenous women are taking part of these processes. So the next steps of FAO's work plan with Indigenous women is to continue creating and facilitating dialogue like this one, where Indigenous women can share their views and perspective, to support the engagement of Indigenous women in the global debate of food systems, to promote research and generation of knowledge done by Indigenous women for Indigenous women and with them on food systems and climate change. Also, we are collaborating with several organizations to establish COVID observatories together with 24 Indigenous communities to understand the impact of COVID on Indigenous peoples, but we are ensuring that there is a gender perspective to understand how Indigenous COVID is also affecting Indigenous women. And we are willing to update the curricula of the Indigenous women leadership schools that we will be implementing in the following years. So just to close, please allow me to share with you the most recent publications of FAO regarding Indigenous women, and you can find them in our website. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mariana, for that comprehensive overview of FAO's work and initiatives with Indigenous women. I also know it's just scratching the surface, so thank you for sharing that summary, and also the key actions and key next steps for the ongoing initiatives, as well as for the UN Food Systems Summit in 2021. And I know there's much to be done, and thankfully there's tremendous capacity and leadership in motion. So thank you for your leadership as well. Tara, I know that you're co-moderating with me today, but I would really love to offer an opportunity to you to share more about your focus on urban Native communities, food landscapes, and nutritional health. And what do you see as why that's so critical to our conversations today?
Thank you, Michaela. I'll keep it brief. As I mentioned previously, I've been an urban Native person my whole life, so that's kind of the lens I view my world through, and those are really the communities that I connect with, both here in Detroit, Baltimore, and I work with a community in Minneapolis as well. Census data today shows that the majority of American Indian Alaska Native people in the United States live in urban areas, yet urban Native healthcare is extremely underfunded, as we know. And because of that, there is very limited health research on Native people, but what there is shows very, very high rates of food insecurity. And as Director Thompson mentioned earlier, there's been so much great work with the Commodity Food Program, the Food Distribution Program on bringing traditional foods into those programs, but those still really aren't accessible for our urban Native relatives who might need those supports even more. And as a nutrition student, I know that food is important to our physical health, but as a Native woman, I've always known that our food is more than just nutrients, it's identity sustaining. And so when we don't have access to our foods, it hurts us not only physically, but mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. So my passion is really bringing urban Native communities into the conversations about food sovereignty and making sure that our urban Native relatives are thought about in health policy, making sure they also have access to food security and our traditional foods, and that they're also on the path to food sovereignty, because we can't be food sovereign until all of our relatives are food secure and food sovereign. Thanks, Michaela.
Thank you so much, Tara. I know there's much behind all of the words that you said. And one phrase that really stuck out to me is that the food is identity sustaining in all of the dimensions of ourselves. Thank you for co-moderating today. It's truly an honor, and I'm excited to continue to watch your work as you continue. Now it's my distinguished honor to introduce and pass the floor to Ambassador Bugailiski, who is the chair of the Group of Friends of Indigenous Peoples and the Canadian ambassador to the Rome-based agencies. She is a pillar of support internationally and in North America, and a strong voice in the cause for Indigenous peoples and especially for Indigenous women. Ambassador, it is truly our honor, and we're so grateful that you're able to join us today and offer some reflections on our speakers so far and what they've shared with us. Over to you. Thank you.
Well, listen, thank you so much, Michaela. It's this is the third online meeting this afternoon, but I really didn't want to miss it. I think it's one of the most important discussions. And I want to thank you, Dr. Settee. Your research is incredibly important, and to remember the history, but as well, obviously, to move forward. And that's why the panel was so inspiring today. To find three young women who are so passionate and yet so well informed and expert in this field really, I think, gives us all a great deal of hope. You know, I'm very humbled to be here. As you mentioned, I am the chair of the Friends of the Indigenous Peoples, but you know, our role is really to listen. And so I want to make a few comments because there's some great questions in the chat line, and I think it's really important to move to them. it's a little hard, as you can imagine, being ambassador from Canada or for anywhere in North America, indeed almost anywhere, to hear the historical record, which is true. I guess the only thing I can be proud of is that the Canadian government and people are more and more recognizing that historical legacy and really trying to move forward through a strong process of reconciliation. It's taking a lot longer than we had hoped or expected, but it is moving forward. And these sessions are so incredibly important to understand the disruption that has occurred of the Indigenous food systems because of colonialism, because of the prejudice and racism that have occurred and continue to, unfortunately. And I really want to talk a little bit about women as well, because they're both the victims, but I'd like to more focus on them as the answers. Unfortunately, as we well know, there is disproportionate violence, sexual violence against women in Canada and in other parts of North America. And we've also noticed that under COVID, this has been exacerbated. More women have lost jobs as a result of COVID. And of course, again, because of the way the system is, Indigenous women are also suffering enormously. I think looking forward, some of the messages you've sent today are extremely important. That is not only respecting Indigenous knowledge and practices, but providing a platform to make sure that they have voice. Dr. Settee, your work is so important because it's giving some real science-based evidence. And that's what this requires to a certain extent to compete on the international stage. And I have no doubt at all that traditional methods and food systems can compete with the best, because they're based on a value system that recognizes, and we're only now getting there with the rest of the world, that recognizes that food is more than just a sustenance. It is medicine, it is a culture, and it needs to be sustainable in the long run. I'll just point to one example, and that was mentioned a couple of times, and that is the recent food policy. It's the first time Canada has a food policy. And not only is it what's in the food policy important, it is actually more the process through which there were extensive consultations, including with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, and the fact that it affirms for the first time unique rights and interests of the First Nations and Métis Nations and Inuit for their self-determination and their right to define their own food systems. So it's a really, really important first step. I would like to hear from some of the panelists about how we can share this knowledge in even a bigger way. I recall when I was posted in Guatemala and having an opportunity to bring First Nations from my country to be able to exchange, and it was an exciting moment. So I would like to hope. And I think maybe just because there's 3 young women up there, let me just talk about one really great story. And this comes in Italy. We were having an exhibition in Venice of architecture. It was actually the curator was none less than Douglas Cardinal, a very famous Indigenous architect. There are 18 Canadian, from Turtle Island, 18 architects came, and 5 of them were women. So I had the opportunity to speak to them as women, and what they had faced as impediments going forward in the area of architecture. And it was no different than almost any other woman I would talk to, the usual set. But at one point, it did take my breath away. And they said, well, you could imagine, as we went onto the building site and we had to face, the laborers there, and they said, where's the architect? Not only were we women, but we were Indigenous women. And that's tenacity. And that's what gives me hope, to see the fact that these young women are able to take up these studies and are being successful in their field and will influence architecture in Canada in the coming years. So you are very much like that, our panelists today. And I want to thank you very much. It's very, very inspiring and also very, very hopeful. Dr. Settee has set some rather dark numbers out there, and she's not incorrect, but the time is now, and the Food System Summit coming up is going to give us an amazing opportunity to be able to change and redirect our food systems. So thank you very much, and I'll leave it to the other participants to get a chance to put in their questions.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Bugailiski, for those reflections and for the great story that you shared at the end from Venice. And indeed, we are surrounded by architects of our food systems, and we have tremendous work ahead of us, and the tenacity and hope to carry us forward, and all of the confluence of the knowledge systems and the platform that we need in order for those conversations to happen. So with that, I would love to start with your question to open up our Q&A portion. And as many attendees may have noticed, we are going over time, but there's so much richness in this conversation that we're just going to keep going and go into the Q&A session and answer some of the questions that have come up, beginning with the question that Ambassador Bugailiski posed, which is, how can we share this knowledge in a larger way and in a good way? So I open that up to the panelists, and perhaps Beth, if I could pass the floor to you to begin.
Nottoway. So in my communities, it's tough when the knowledge holders aren't always the ones that are first asked or the ones that have the seat at the table. So we focus on supporting what we call those grassroots champions. It's finding that person in tribal communities that's going to hold this passion and this work. And it's usually a young woman with a young family. And so how do we help her develop these skills, that she has the knowledge, but how do you navigate that knowledge? How do you send that up the chain to your council? There is, this really amazing effort for folks of all agencies and organizations to have better equitable knowledge share and to bring everybody to the table. And yet there's still some fumblings there where we're not quite, we don't have maybe that person that holds all that knowledge at that table. You might have the chief or spokesperson of a community, but that might not be the best person that is able to share those knowledge shares. There's also some trepidation for sharing our knowledge because there's not a really great history of knowledge being respected and honored in a way. And so much of what our knowledge is connected to are some things that are personal for tribal communities, or some ceremonies that aren't necessarily available for public interaction. So I would say, anytime you engage in this work and these conversations, we all need to carry like this massive amount of grace and hold these sensitivities in our minds. And so, it really is going to depend on which community you're working with. All of us have our different priorities and structures, and so it's going to look. I would so wish that I've been asked this so many times, like, show me the one map that shows me where everybody is, or show me the one book that tells the whole story of all of our communities, and it doesn't exist, But what does exist are the things that are happening here in this conversation, which is that trust building, and that takes time, but it's absolutely the way to get there. And know that when you are talking about our knowledge, it's all of our past histories, and it's absolutely our visions for going forward. And that's why I think it's just so inspiring to hear about this marriage of this research and the policy and these efforts and the urban native population. I'm so feeling that. I'm just coming back from urban into rural life, and so really speak to those both worlds. Because it's enormously complex, but I can tell you, there's so much good mind around finding a way forward, because no matter what, we're all in this climate together. We all share watersheds with each other. We all have ancestors that bring wisdom with them. So if we could just all pause and honor those pieces, then we'll find that common space where we will, to share, we'll continue to share, but it's like we all have to kind of come to it with our good mind and kind of perspectives in place. So Nottoway for the question. It's such a delight to meet you.
Thank you, Beth. I posed the same question to Elisa if you wanted to also respond.
I've just been taken away. Could you say the question again?
Absolutely.
I have kids in my background, as we're all.
That's good. That's good. Well, perhaps it also connects with the question that the ambassador posed was, how can we share this knowledge in a larger way and in a good way? And perhaps I could also expand the question to include children, and thinking about the children in your life and expanding on how we can share that knowledge in a good way.
Yeah, I think, that's why we do this work, right? Why are we doing this work? And it's always for our future generations. And also, I think I tried to share in my remarks just a story about we get the training. We're directed to get the training that we need to sit at those tables. And you can go forward, you can go as high as you can go, but if you don't have the skills and connection to culture, that is missing, especially if you choose to work in this space. So I used my own personal example of nutrition. Like, I could continue to go and find the micronutrient of the seed that does, whatever it does, right? Whatever its intention. But if you don't have that connection to community and that connection to those skills that are uniquely you, wherever you are, if you are in an urban setting, and it is food grounds us, and that remains something that is true. And I think we're seeing that. Like, I go back to where we're at right now, our greatest challenge, and I think of the ambassador's remarks around Canada and our food policy and what we were faced with in recognizing that there were inequities in food as COVID presented itself. Food insecurity in our communities existed prior to COVID, and it only was strengthened by it. But then when we responded to, how can we put food, put resources on the table to support communities, it was around emergency food. But Indigenous communities we're at a point where, you wanted to organize around long-term stability. So how you define the parameters of the work that people do limits the work. So I just answered that in two ways. One, that solutions are to be driven by communities and involving people and processes that direct the way resources, and namely sometimes that is money, but that is also traditional knowledge, right? Knowledge is power, and I think if we turn it back to children in our communities, it's finding ways to share that within the school systems. And I see that in my own community where there is efforts to reintegrate traditional foodways into the curriculum, and really just supporting that. As a trustee in my community, we've had proposals come for the school to support this kind of work, and this work is important, so we continue to support it. So a few answers there, but hopefully it captured some of those things that can be expanded in other regions as well.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you, Lisa. And I think it's a comprehensive question. Knowledge reaches and travels across many different planes and fields and generations. So thank you for that comprehensive answer. And I share the same question with Mariana and then to Tara. And I know there's so many amazing questions in our Q&A box, and unfortunately we won't be able to reach them today, but we'll close on this question. We'll share the questions with all of our panelists and speakers today, with opportunities to reach out in the future. And perhaps this is a conversation that we can carry forward. So over to you, Mariana, on the question of how can we share this knowledge in a good way and through the FAO perspective on your work with Indigenous women.
Thank you very much, Michaela. And yes, it is a big challenge, and as our speakers and Beth, Elisa have just said that it's not one way and it's not easy. But I would like to share one project that we are willing to develop right now exactly on sharing knowledge. We are talking to the university, Thompson Rivers University, with the Indigenous Peoples Unit there. And they have explained us a lot on Indigenous research. They told us Indigenous peoples are researchers per nature, and Indigenous peoples can do research, and they have their own way to do research and to share the knowledge. So creating projects that enhance the indigenous or support Indigenous women and Indigenous peoples to do their own research is one of the ways of supporting the expansion, the sharing of knowledge that Indigenous women and Indigenous people have. We are talking about the possibility, and we are learning and working with Thompson Rivers University of planning the Knowledge Makers Initiative for Indigenous women, where is the Thompson Rivers University share the techniques and processes of developing a research and academic research with a focus, of course, with a perspective of Indigenous, from Indigenous peoples, and allow Indigenous peoples to use their own methodologies to do the research and to focus on what they find relevant and important to share about their communities, about their challenges. And then, well, the idea that we're trying to hold with this initiative is that to create a gathering of several research done by Indigenous women on their views of food systems and their challenges, and to share it with policymakers and to the global debate on food systems. So I think that what we have learned from working with Indigenous women is that they can be researchers themselves. They have doing research, and supporting these processes and supporting them to do research is one way to share this knowledge without or respecting their property, intellectual property rights, and the sacred areas and the sacred activities of their communities and the sacred knowledge of their communities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mariana. And Tara, over to you for the same question.
Yeah, I think Mariana actually said a lot of what I would say, but I think as a researcher, it's really important that I take my view as an Indigenous woman with me in everything I do. And so a lot of that is maybe putting down some of those Western research methodologies, not putting down, but setting them aside and thinking critically, like, what does the community need? What's important to them? How can I evaluate and tell this story in a way that is powerful to the communities? Because I think a lot of research can be very deficit-based, especially when you think about nutrition. A lot of it's on poor diet quality without fully contextualizing the colonial history of what happened to our food systems. But there's also so much strength that we have in our communities, and finding ways to pull those stories of strength and resilience through is kind of how I try to do that.
Tara, thanks for offering us your perspective as a current student in this work, doing research as an Indigenous woman. And Ambassador Bugaliski, I just want to thank you for that question that draws upon the past and looks forward facing, and is also inclusive of all of the communities engaged in this conversation. So thank you for joining us on your 4th meeting of the day.
Well, incredible, thoughtful, and very contextual responses. It seemed like a simple question, but it was not. And I appreciate the seriousness with which you responded. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for joining us. And thank you to all of the panelists for your responses. And now we'll turn to our closing remarks for the day. And we'll share all of the incredible questions that have been put in the Q&A box with our speakers. Thank you for sharing them. If there is a particular question that you'd really like a response to, please include how they can reach out to you, if it's an email address or how they could share that response. With the full respect that all of our speakers are incredibly busy people, and that these answers may be coming forth in their work. So pay attention to what's coming forth. With that, Dr. Settee, if you are still with us, learning how to do this. Dr. Settee, you are here. If I could pass the floor to you first to offer your closing remarks and a takeaway message for today.
Thank you all for the inspiring information, and really gives my heart hope that all this exciting, innovative, and well-grounded work is being done. And I love the voice of the women who talk about it as a cultural, a spiritual, and an Indigenous, it's something that goes beyond just the plate of food, but it's at the center of our being. I just have one remark that maybe helps to situate what is in the broader level, and that, we didn't get it at the spot because people were only, bad intention. I think, in my field of research, I see people who honestly believe that genetically modifying foods will lead to more food. But, and I think that I've seen some of my colleagues actually set aside, fired for questioning some of the science that is being done to food. Bovine growth hormone is one case. And so, some of my colleagues have paid with their careers for being the voice of asking questions about food safety, food security. We have to understand that we are here today because of state policies that are continuing to be made. And even within the FAO, I'm sure everyone that is attached to FAO is very aware that there's a lot of groundswell coming. There's a lot of angst telling FAO, if we're going to succeed, or if we're going to exist as Indigenous peoples, we have to look honestly at the policies and at the global governance systems that keep Indigenous people on our knees. And so we need to situate our work within this broader critical framework, recognizing we must do the work, but we also must recognize that there are these very intransigent governance systems propped up by the wealthiest governments in the world. So, I mean, it does sound like it formidable in some ways, but mark my words, the women of this world are uniting. And, we see evidence of it daily. And so I think that as scholars, we have an onus to put this in all of our curriculum, right from the very tiny little children. But not only the curriculum, the practice. We need to recognize that by working the soil ourselves, that it becomes an act of resistance. And the seed saving that the young women mentioned prior is an act of resistance. So thank you for all of your work, and continue the good fight, knowing that there are millions with you, with us. Yeah.
Thank you, and miigwech, Dr. Settee. It was a pleasure to hear you speak and have you close us out in such a great way. I just wanted to pass this final closing to our Elder Rose Highbear and have her close us out in a good way with song or prayer, whatever she deems to do. Rose, over to you whenever you're ready.
Elder Rose, I think there you go.
Thank you so much. The first thing that comes to mind, of course, is thank you. And, thank you to the spirit world, because they have all brought us to be together in this wonderful circle of women on a very special day. When the sun returns to this spot every day, we have the power and the gifts that are bestowed from the spirit world to help us, to strengthen us, to protect us in our work, and to always remember to share, to build and share the hope. Like among my people, we have chokecherry. Chokecherry has a power in it of restoring hope. Moldirt has the power to restore to restore hope. And so I just want to say that it's been a wonderful pleasure to be here and to hear all the wisdom of all of my sisters, and that my prayer is for you all to have that that hope, that healing for your own selves and for your family circles. That's so important, that you always are circled with protection so that you can continue this work that is essential to the future of our world. Just say Plamie Wopila Mitako Yayo Yasi.
Rose, thank you for your blessings this morning, for your prayer and song this morning, and for closing us in a good way with your blessings and well wishes for all of our families and communities. And I want to thank all of our speakers and panelists and all of my colleagues at FAO for making this webinar possible today, and to Ambassador Bugailiski for joining us, to Director Sharan for making this platform available, and for all of who have made this event possible today, for setting aside the time to join us, and for all of the audience members. It's been a powerful opportunity to listen and to learn and to share together. And to all of our speakers, I wish you the best in all of your work. And to all of those listening who are working in this space, I wish you all the best. And I hope that we're able to come together again soon and to carry on strong alongside each other from afar. And hopefully we'll be able to meet in person one day. And to Tara, thank you for co-moderating today. And I offer the final word to you.
Tough act to follow, Michaela. Thank you all for being here and for sharing the space. And I just really want to echo Michaela's gratitude for everybody that's here, both the panelists, speakers, and Ambassador, and Rose, of course, as well as all the people in the audience. I know we're all doing important work for our communities, and I'm so grateful for everybody's efforts and to share this space with you all. Miigwech and Bamupi.
Thank you, everyone. So I will take this last second to remind everyone that we can't close this webinar without thanking Michaela for the fantastic work that she's done to get us all together on this platform. So thank you, Michaela, and thank you everyone for joining. Goodbye.